And now, Jamie, let's get to the news. The Patriots signing Stefon Diggs to a 3-year, $69 million deal with $26 million guaranteed, reportedly ahead of schedule, according to ESPN, in his recovery from a torn ACL. Diggs was actually the number 18 wide receiver per game in full PPR last year. And, what do you think about him going to the Patriots here on this 3-year deal?
I think from the team standpoint, it's a smart move. It's basically a 1-year deal. I would, sort of look at it that way. And they probably had to pay up to get him just because of what the market looks like right now for wide receivers. I'm sure it probably came down just based on reports between him and Amari Cooper. And they probably felt like he's a better fit for their team now as opposed to where Cooper is, which tells you something about Cooper. If that's the case, knowing that Diggs will be 32 in November coming off a torn ACL. But they needed to get some veteran in there. This is a good signing for Drake Maye because as we've seen, and you said it, Diggs, you look at CJ Stroud, he got off to a shaky start last year, but he was actually better when Diggs was on the field. Stroud was than when Diggs left the field. Obviously that coincides with Nico Collins with the injury he sustained and then losing Tank Dell at the end of the year. So the receiving core really was never whole throughout the course of the season. But I think just in terms of what Diggs did for Josh Allen as a young quarterback, certainly helped him, elevate his game. Clearly, this is not the same receiver at this point in his career, but it does bring some stability to his receiving core, which was just, barren at this point. Now, I think they're going to be heavily involved in the draft at this position because they need to add more skill players around him. I think just bringing in Matt Collins and Stefon Diggs doesn't solve the problem, but it helps. So Drake Maye, I think, gets a little bit of a boost. Not anything you want to just say, okay, now he's a must-start quarterback, but I think it just makes it more attractive to draft him as a late-round guy with the hope that he could become, a solid sleeper, maybe in a breakout. In terms of Diggs on his own, again, 32 coming off, or 31, going to be 32 coming off the ACL tear. He should lead the team in targets. I think it's going to be fun to see what happens, with the Giants at 3 and the Patriots at 4 when it comes to Travis Hunter, because it'd be very surprising if he gets past those two teams. Unless somebody trades up, to get in front of them. But if they do put him at receiver, then it wouldn't shock me if, in terms of the Patriots at least, if Hunter's the best receiver on the team. So Diggs for now in pencil, should lead the team in targets. Last year was on pace for 100 catches, just a little over 1,000 yards and 6 touchdowns. So still could be a number 3 fantasy receiver. I would prefer to still draft him as a late number, or, low end number 3, more of a high end number 4 guy. Just again, the circumstances being what they are, coming off the ACL tear and his age, but probably good value. So round 7, round 8 is the earliest I would look for him. I'll be a little bit more optimistic if he's healthier, but how I feel about older receivers, especially when they turn 32. I'm not going to be heavily invested in Stefon Diggs, but again, landing spot. If you're just looking at the free agents, Devontae Adams probably the best, and this might be the second best, just in terms of going to a place where he gets a big opportunity.
I would be pretty. I think I'd be excited about it, fairly excited. From like a wide receiver 2-3 kind of standpoint in fantasy, if you weren't coming off a torn ACL.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just kind of a bummer.
That part of it is a bummer, and we have all the data on the players that come back from it. We saw with Godwin, but what I think about, and Jamie broke this down well, I thought really well, was if they chose Diggs over Cooper, was it specifically to fit a role within that offense? Josh McDaniels coming over, what we know historically about that specific kind of offense is that the slot is going to be heavily targeted. Cooper, not a lot of experience playing out of the slot, can play out of the slot, more of an outside X. Diggs started to move into the slot at times at the end with Buffalo and then with Houston. And maybe coming off the ACL is no longer a boundary receiver. If he's now that slot guy who they can rely on, and that's the reason they brought him in, that's a big role that could lead to a lot of targets next year and a lot of volume for PPR leagues. So I do want to see what they do in the draft, what kind of talent they add. I think they need to add O-line over receivers, as crazy as that sounds. I'm most worried about that and if that can derail the whole offense. But I'm intrigued by this fit because I think there's a lot of target upside here.
Yeah, for sure. And the slot rate that you mentioned, now they didn't have, True Media didn't calculate slot rate in Diggs' first 2 seasons, but since then, last year's slot rate was a career high. 41% slot rate for Stefon Diggs.